So today's topic, the first session, for those of us that were together for the first session, talked about the idea of Judaism and universal ethics, right? That we, as a tradition, believe that we have a responsibility in some ways for all human beings in the world, but we also have a very, as we talked about last week, a very particular, different, more intense obligation for our fellow Jews. And I think that seemed probably fairly obvious for everybody until a little more recently. Somebody pointed out last week on the call that, because our community is so affluent and we don't have, thank God, we do have need in the Jewish community, but we don't have the kind of need that our ancestors had, that maybe perhaps it influences us to make different kinds of choices. Because I teach teenagers and I'm back to teaching them in person, it keeps me always very, very humble. I had a teacher once when I was in middle schools that said, if you really want to practice humility, take something that you really love and teach it to teenagers. So yesterday I was with the 8th graders and we had an Ask the Rabbi session. And, they asked me really easy questions like, how do I know there's a God? Why didn't God stop the Holocaust? Nice light fare for, first thing on a Sunday morning. So we ended up talking, they have a real, this is a challenge, and this is a challenge for adults too. Like, what if these Bible stories aren't true? What if they're not true? What if Noah never really built an ark? So I talked to them about the idea of the moral things that we learn from the text, that even if it's not literally historically true, that the Torah doesn't come to teach us history, the Torah comes to teach us morality. And so one of the things we started talking about was the Exodus from Egypt. And what is, and people that have come on Shabbat have heard me talk about it many times, but what does the Exodus from Egypt come to teach us? And one of the main things that was a break in history is that it came to teach us that God was on the side of sin, which in a world, and even not even that long ago, where people believed in the divine rights of kings to rule, that God was, in most society, God was on the side of, the king or the ruler. It's rather, Judaism comes to teach us that God is on the side of the underdog. And one of the young women said, I'm going to ask people that aren't muted to please, if you could mute yourselves. Jerry, Martha, I'm just looking. Flo.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, if you could just mute yourselves. I'm supposed to know how to mute you, but I don't. So God is on the side of the underdog. And one young woman in the class said, yeah, if they're Jews. So I'm like, well, but no, the Torah comes to tell us, created in the divine image, creating God's image, and started to cite some of the texts that we learned together. And she said, well, then why did God kill the entire Egyptian army? And I'm like, well, we have to remember that the Egyptians were complicit in slavery, and they were complicit in the murder of the firstborn. And she said, couldn't God have just talked to them and taught them a better way? Why did God have to kill them all? And I'm like, well, I think we're out of time now. The class was really great. I'll see you. Like, bye. So I don't think I did a good job of convincing her of anything, but it was an interesting challenge. And why am I introducing this? I feel like we're going to look at some things today about what happens when there are competing needs between the non-Jewish community and the Jewish community, and how does one allocate limited funds in that, when you're taking these things into consideration. And, the thing about Judaism is when Judaism tells us we should do something, Jewish law is very precise in defining what that means. I heard a comedian, I thought this was very funny, that said, the Jewish calendar is so specific, it includes minutes. you've never heard anybody say, what time does Christmas start? You know, we take that for granted, right? What time does Shabbat start? What time does Shabbat end? What time is Nila? What time is shofar blowing? Like in Judaism, the time is not like, oh, around 6. Like it's at 6:03, we can blow shofar, but not a minute before. Like it's a very precise system. So when Judaism asks the question or wants to know, what are our obligations with competing needs in the world? How do we determine, you know, the allocation of our limited funds? Judaism is not going to be like, you know, just do what you think is best, right? It's going to give us some real guidance. But what we're going to see is that even our great rabbis don't always agree, which makes it, you know, interesting.
Sure.
No, I
Julie, did you have your hand up?
Sure.
Yeah.
okay.
It didn't work on the iPad.
Wait, now, okay.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. You know, this reminded me, and you're the rabbi, you can tell me, was it Moses who bargained with God or Abraham who bargained with God about if there's, can't you save, was it Sodom and Gomorrah
Yeah,
or?
Abraham was Sodom and Gomorrah.
Are
Moses
there
bargained
not
for the
one
Israelites.
righteous person? I mean, so what
Right.
this young woman was doing was completely within the Jewish tradition.
Right.
And I love that. That's, you know, what we want people saying, you know, even some of these people might have been salvageable. That it's not the Exodus that bugs me as much as the cherem on the Amalekites. I mean, that was they got rid of all the animals and the people.
Right.
And
Okay,
you
so
know.
we're going to talk about competing tzedakah needs.
That's
look,
better.
This is the thing. You know what? This is the thing, and I think I started by saying this in the very first session. Like, we need to. I feel like we live in a world where I think we all need to. I mean, we just heard on the news. Where are they taking down a statue of Lincoln? I can't remember, but now Lincoln's statue is coming down. So I said to my husband, you know, maybe the best policy going forward in the world is no more statues about anybody ever. Just don't put up statues anymore about anybody, because there's not going to be a human being. I mean, I was being facetious, but there is no human being in the world that would have a statue that if you dug into their closet, and I'm going to tell you, this even includes me, if you dig into their closet, you're not going to find something that would be, by somebody's morality, if not today, 50 years down the road from now, is going to be so horrific in the eyes of the population that lives then, assuming that morality evolves as we think that it does, that any of us could pass that litmus test. Who was the woman? All right, never mind. So just, you know, now I've got, like, what did the rabbi do that she, you know, couldn't have a statue? So I'll tell you later. So, you know, we have to, I've always felt you know, if you have to judge Judaism, you cannot judge everything in Judaism by the times that we live in. There are going to be things that are upsetting to us. There are going to be things that don't match our morality. There is slavery, there is genocide and war. There are all kinds of things. And one of the things we're going to see today, interestingly enough, is how Jewish law evolves and addresses the time that it lives in, and the idea that you can say, you know what, that doesn't strike me as fitting into our morality today, and therefore we have to shift things, is part of our tradition for 2,000 years. It's not new. Like, we're not the first people to struggle with certain things, and we're going to see that today. So, you know, I can't decide whether I should do this at the beginning or the end. But I'm going to give you I think I'll just do it at the beginning. Keep it in your mind. Judaism is not the only religion or the only society that needs to make tough decisions about allocating funds, since resources are limited, and deciding between my people or other people.
Thank you.
And one of the examples that I will give to you is something that we are all very currently living with. And that is the question of COVID vaccines. Were we really happy that the Biden administration made sure to secure enough COVID vaccines for Americans so that we could all get vaccinated, and enough vaccines so that we can get our boosters, and I got mine, before other people in the world didn't get there first? Did any of you say, send it overseas? All right, Deanna, our vaccine queen, we'll let you say something before we look at some sources.
You're actually hitting on a very sore subject for me, because in April, once it became more readily available, I literally did call the public health department and say, I have a registered nurse. She can't get the vaccination. I have extras. They're going to go to waste. They literally just went in the garbage this last week because they did expire. We couldn't find enough people. I said, can I send them to her in Haiti? Please. I will find out. I will do it at my own expense. And I was told absolutely not. And it is very frustrating to me because, and I understand there's so many moving parts and they can't have people willy-nilly shipping things around the world. And who knows if I was going to just send it, but who knows if other people were doing it for profit.
Right.
But it is very, very frustrating. And I've really been struggling with this for the year, that we, not at the beginning, but starting in late April, we had enough. And how do we reconcile this with a life-saving tiny little bottle? I could have put it on ice. I could have shipped it. And I was told, no, we need you to waste it instead.
Right. I mean, that's the fact that there's no system to do this. I mean, you probably know that Israel, when it had a lot of vaccine that was getting ready to expire, offered it to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority did not want Zionist vaccine. So Israel made a deal with South Korea and got the vaccines to South Korea for a deal that at a later date, when, South Korea had fresh vaccine, that they would make a swap, but it enabled South Korea to begin vaccinating much more quickly than they would have been able to. So it's really unfortunate that our government isn't nimble enough to do that. Nonetheless, with all the waste, with all the inability to get it to people outside of the United States who would be more than happy to have it in their arms, did anybody ever say in their heads, what a shame that a wealthy, powerful country like the United States enabled all of us that wanted it to get it? It really should have gone to Africa first. We could all wait. So I just want you, if you judge the text, right, and you judge the text that you might judge about this idea of why our tradition insists that Jews are taken care of first, I'd like to just, put this out as a real world example that sometimes we do expect that our government and our leaders take care of us first. So just saying. All right, so let's look at our first source. Now, I will tell you, I have had Nancy and Brian trying to figure out for me for days. Many of you on your screen have the two little bars that enable you to make the text bigger or smaller and see everybody on Zoom. And for some reason, it's not working on my Zoom, which is why every week I have to take the text down. So, and if I thought it was just me, but if Nancy and Brian can't figure it out, there's just a glitch somewhere. So we're still hoping that maybe it will be fixed by the end of class. So, we're going to read the text out loud together, and we're going to read it slowly. And I'm going to try to keep it up as long as possible, but for the discussion's sake, I can't see you, which is why I have to take it down. Okay, so this is from the Talmud. And it's going to talk about, how you prioritize resources. So in the case of a cistern, which belongs to the people of the town, if there is enough water for only the townspeople or others, the townspeople have precedence in the drinking water. So that makes a lot of sense, right? You only have so much water. You don't have enough water for everybody. You only have enough water for your town. Your obligation is to provide water for the people of your town. So that would be fairly obvious, right? I don't think any of us would think that that was a surprise that you had to give away your water. However, what about your animals? right? What about your animals? Now, it's not just because, I mean, your animals are your livelihood, right? Your animals, you have an obligation to care for your animals, but your animals for people in ancient time was not your pet dog or your cat, right? It was, your mode of transportation, your mode of carrying things, maybe produce or whatever you needed, or you were selling from one place to another. It was the thing that provided you perhaps with milk or with eggs or wherever. And if those things died because of lack of water, you would have no way to make a living. So, but do animals have precedence over human life, right? Our tradition tells us that animals don't have precedence over human life. So now you see a moral dilemma, right? You see a real moral dilemma, because we always put human beings over animals. But when your animals are your livelihood and then you can't make a living, and then you could starve to death, like, how do you allocate the water? So others or the townspeople's animals, the lives of others have precedence over the animals. That's one opinion. Rabbi Yossi says that the townspeople's animals have precedence before the lives of others. So there's already a debate in the tradition, right? The Talmud is not going to answer this, which is why Judaism becomes an interpretive tradition, because very often our earliest sources, this is very indicative of the Talmud, that it leaves things unanswered. And this is such a difficult sort of moral dilemma that you actually have, the joke, two Jews, three opinions. It's not actually, it's based on our rabbinic literature. And the idea that sometimes when you are hashing out Jewish law, when you're hashing out moral issues, there can actually be more than one right opinion. Which is something I think even modern society struggles with, the idea that you could have more than one right moral opinion. The animals of the townspeople or the animals of others, the animals of the townspeople, right? So even if you believe you have to give your water to the other town over before you do your animals, it's very clear, that your animals have precedence over other people's animals. Drinking water for the others or the laundry of the townspeople. Now, this might surprise you. The lives of others have precedence over over your laundry. Rabbi Yossi says the laundry of the townspeople becomes before the lives of others. And then, of course, if you're deciding between laundry and laundry, the townspeople's laundry. So there are this source presents us with this moral dilemma. Right? This moral dilemma between what is the definition of your needs? How long would you be willing to go without a shower to make sure that somebody else's animals or even other people had water? How much? My son, when he was in college, our middle son Zachary went through and I'm proud to say all my kids are very tzedakah oriented, very, very charitable. But Zachary, because I said teenagers keep you humble, for a long time would pose this moral dilemma to us, which was, why should we have any luxury when people are starving? Why should I eat a candy bar? Why is it right for me to ever have a candy bar, or ever take a vacation, or ever buy a new car? Why is it, or even drive a car? Why is that ever right and okay when I know other people in the world are starving? And I would say, Judaism allows for us to be able to enjoy our lives and to, enjoy the things that we have. And we still have a responsibility for others, but we don't have to live, like monks. And he would say, well, why is that right? Why is that okay? So the Talmud is really presenting this dilemma. I mean, laundry seems like you might think, like, I could live without clean laundry forever as long as I was saving a human life. And I would say, really? Is that really how you live your life? How any of us live our lives? Elise, I see you have your hand up. You need to unmute though. Elise, you're not unmuted. We can't hear you.
Okay, I thought sorry, you're not unmuting people. Okay,
No, you're on your own.
when did Rabbi Yossi live?
So
About.
Rabbi Yossi lived about 2,000 years ago. We meet him in the Haggadah. He's not Jose, as we sometimes see his name spelled. It's Yossi. The J is silent if your Haggadah has his name spelled that way. So now you know you can impress your Seder guests.
Okay. So the Talmud, the rabbi gave his opinion 2,000 years ago. Back then, it wasn't a matter of washing your laundry and, looking great when you go out shopping. Clean laundry had to do with saving a life, with fighting off disease. And I think that a lot of, or most of what the tradition says has to be looked at in terms of the history and the society of the time, so that we can understand why they said it. Then we can go and make the changes. I can understand why Rabbi Yossi said that. I really can. And it struck me when you first read it that, dirty laundry, the dirty dishes, not separating meat and milk, this all made a lot of sense back then. Doesn't now, but I mean, now, as you said, teenagers, they probably run around in dirty laundry all the time when they're away at school.
So, the question is, I mean, you've got the idea that it's, literally dirty laundry. And by the way, townspeople in this story can mean other Jews, right? It's not this is not actually dividing between Jews and non-Jews. This could be if the Yossi HaGalil, he lived in the Galil.
But it really seems to, his answers seem to be determined by what will keep people alive. What do we need to do to keep the people alive? And then go to the next level. And we need the animals, as you said, because of their livelihood. It's not the cat and the dog. And he probably would agree with the Koreans, is it, who eat the dogs, their dogs, because they'd starve otherwise. It just seems to me that the arguments are based on, even the person who would take the opposing argument, it's a question of survival.
Okay, so let's go. I want to go on. So I'm going to ask you to remute yourself because I don't know how to mute and unmute everybody. So it could be, as Elise suggests, that laundry symbolizes health, right? That walking around in dirty laundry and, eventually it's gross. But it's also possible that it's really just like, how do you determine a hierarchy of need, and what is it that human beings need minimally before you share with others? And so you see that there's even a debate amongst the animals, right? Like, I think we probably feel somewhat comfortable saying, well, how could you let your animals, die of starvation and then you would have nothing? So of course we have to keep it in our community. But as I said, like, at what point we live in a society that goes way far beyond our basic human needs. And even so, like, at what point does any of us draw the line and say, anything above this, I'm giving to others, right? We all ask that question. And because we live in such an affluent society, and somebody was telling me yesterday, she studies with an Orthodox rabbi, and his fundraising pitch to his students, which I'll see if it works on any of you. So has God been good to you this year? And she found that very moving and probably gave a lot of money, because the idea was, we talk a lot about like a life of privilege. We are not making the kind of choices, most of us, I think any of us on this call, between, you know, putting food on the table and something else. So, so you see that, so Judaism begins to create this hierarchy of how do you decide the priority of who you take care of first. Martha. Well, you know, you have to unmute though.
Is that better? Can you hear me
Yes,
now?
yes.
Okay. The question is, with charity, aren't we often asked to give according to the need of the person, not because of our perceived need? So that somebody who's used to a life of luxury, we are not supposed to have them, not receive that we're supposed to recognize it. And that's a hard thing to say. If there are other people who are at ground level, why are we supporting the one at, the 5th floor or something?
Well, that's what and we actually did speak about this last week, that our tradition also takes in what they would call the dignity of the person in need. And there is an idea in Judaism that you try to help people. I mean, obviously not, to maintain sort of the dignity of their need.
Mhm.
So, you would try to keep them in their home instead of saying to them, you know what, we could provide a perfectly lovely, 2-bedroom apartment that would be just fine for you. There is a sense that you try to say, if I can keep you in your lovely home or whatever. But I think that, that ultimately breaks down. Like, that's not really how Jewish charity is able to conduct itself, because who could really afford to do it at that level? All right, let's go on. I want to look at a couple of other sources, and I know people have their hands up, but I want to look at some other sources. Okay, so here's again a hierarchy of need. If someone has food in their home and wishes also to give to charity and support others from his resources, how should they do so, right? So you have food, you have abundance, you have enough. How do you determine who you help first? First one supports one's parents. If there's a surplus, then support your siblings. If there is a surplus, then support your extended family. If there is a surplus, then support those in your neighborhood. If there's a surplus, then support those in your city. If there is a surplus, then support the rest of the Jewish people. Right? So the hierarchy of need is your own family, right? You take care of the needs of your family. And of course, no surprise that there's a hierarchy, that your parents take precedence over your siblings, and then your extended family. And this idea that the people that you have your first and primary obligation to are not the townspeople in the town over, and not even the people in your neighborhood, and not even, fellow Jews, that your first responsibility is towards your own family. So now we'll just open it up. If people want to talk a little bit about, your reaction to that. Lois?
Well, this is more of a thought I had before, and you've often used the term aspirational, and statements like, take care of the person, to protect their dignity. It sensitizes you to treating everybody with dignity, even, even the poor people, or even a rich person that's in trouble. So I think it's not necessarily taken literally. It's taken to make sure you are careful about the dignity of others.
Right. One of the examples that I gave last week, which I think to me was one of the only times I actually saw this in real action, was when the Argentinian economy collapsed. And many Argentinian Jews who had been, pretty well off, lost everything. And many of them at that point decided to make Aliyah. And the Israeli authorities made the decision that even though it would have been much less expensive to bring them over, put them in an apartment, and buy them new furniture in Israel, and probably better for the Israeli economy also, they decided to pay for them to do, it's called a lift. When you ship all your stuff to Israel, to pay for a lift for these families so that they could bring their things with them. And I remember that was like the only time that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are other times that it's happened, but it's the only time that I was aware of in a really substantial way to see that like put into play. And I think, you know, one could argue about the cost of that, but being people who could relate to what it would mean to like lose your house, lose your job, have to leave, you know, to go to Israel, the comfort that you would get from bringing your things with you. Like, I think we, you know, I think we kind of could relate to that. Flo?
There's a little caveat to that, though, if I remember correctly, because my sister was a foreign student in Argentina, so she knew a lot of those families. And the point was, the ones that did go and make Aliyah to Israel, they could not bring their money. If they had any money, they had to leave it in Argentina. That was the fact.
Wait, but that was because of the Argentinian government, not because of Israel.
Okay, but the people who stayed, a lot of the other people who stayed there did not make Aliyah because they didn't want to lose their money.
Right,
I mean, that's a real
That
dilemma.
wasn't- Right, but that wasn't up to the Israeli government. That was, you know, the Argentinian government. It's not the only time in history, which that story is repeated over and over and over again, that when Jews want to leave, they have to leave with, you know, nothing. This happened, you know, it's happened throughout our history. By the way, a lot of people stayed, and I had the opportunity to visit Buenos Aires a couple of years ago, and it's the most unbelievable, vibrant, wonderful community. But I think that we, and for sure our kids, don't really understand that when you visit a lot of these, you know, communities all over the world, they have one eye on Israel all the time. The question about when do we go? When do we go? Is real in their minds in a way that it's not really for us, right? My daughter-in-law asked me this at some point during the Trump administration. Her parents are Israeli, but she's got grandparents that fled, you know, Germany. And she said to me, how would we know when it was time to go? How would we know? So many generations of Jews made the wrong calculation about when to go. You know, we'll stay just a little longer. We have our money here. We know the culture. This will pass. You know, what, and all of us that are sitting in the United States, our ancestors, by and large, unless they were Holocaust survivors, made the right calculation, right, to go when they went. So you know, it was a chilling question to ask. You know, she wasn't born in the United States, so she's got a little bit of a different feeling about, you know, she's really probably more Israeli, I would say, than American, though she's lived here since she was a young child. So, you know, I think her, and she's totally bilingual. So going to Israel for her is, you know, all her family's there. But it was a chilling question to think about that, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So let's go back to a hierarchy of needs, right? Your family over your village. Martha?
I listened earlier this week to Temple Emmanuel's Stryker School, which has had wonderful programs. And they had one of my least favorite persons, which was Peter Baynard, who should be banned. And the other person was Brett Stevens. And this question was asked at the end, the one that you just posed, where he responded, he being Brett Stevens, that he couldn't believe that some Jews, he said, based on our history, there has to be a gut feeling that it's time, or recognizing anti-Semitism, that he said, frankly, he thought that Jews who ignored anti-Semitism or didn't seem to recognize it were the stupidest Jews, because based on our history, we would know when it's time to leave, or at least be aware of it. It was quite an interesting statement. And of course, Peter Baynard felt that wearing his yarmulke and walking around New York makes him an educator.
Right, well, we won't get into our feelings about, you know, having an eye on knowing that we would have a place to go. If it was up to Peter Baynard, we wouldn't have that anymore. Deanna, are you, I thought you had, where are you? Are you still here? Do you had your hand up before? I was just letting, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I took it down because the other comment was about what I've been pondering about what Zach said, but we had this conversation several years ago. As I think most of you know, I do come from a Holocaust surviving family. My mom was born in Poland and was a hidden child. And there have been times where I wonder, it's like, you're talking about how the Argentinians have an eye on Israel. And I always have that extra, unfortunately, it's just part of the psyche of being in a survivor family, that there's that extra, when do I need to know? When am I, the frog in the hot water, and frog jumps in the pot and the water keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And how do you know when it goes from being warm water to frog soup? And I've had that conversation, and I have wondered it also, just like Sahar has, at what point and where would we go? Because I'm not sure if the world becomes unsafe for Jews, especially in the world we live in now. Do we go to Israel? Do we go to Canada? Where do we go? How far is far enough? Where's safe? And there was an election several years ago, and a lot of the specific competitions went in ways that were very concerning and felt a little bit or a lot bit anti-Semitic to me. And I just remember looking at the babies that I had at the time and thinking, how can I keep them safe? So I think her question is very real, but I don't know what the answer is. And I also
say, we're going to
Yeah.
have, let's do a whole session. We'll do a session on anti-Semitism.
Okay.
That's separate from Jewish ethics, because I know
Okay.
it was my fault. I started it.
Okay, but I
And
do want
now
to address
we're-
that question though, because that is ethics and choices. And when he's talking about how do I be candid about how do I go on vacation while others can't, I think it's a hard thing to answer without sounding just super heartless and capitalistic. But the truth of it is, if you have a candy bar, or if you go on a vacation, or if you forego that, that's not going to help any of those people. That decision in that moment is not going to help any of the people that you're talking about.
Unless you take the money and you send it somewhere to feed hungry people.
100%,
That's right.
100%.
That's, So look,
100%.
this is the
Wait,
thing
but-
about Judaism, is that we are actually told that when we are held accountable after our deaths in the
Mhm.
world to come, one of the things that we're going to be asked is, why didn't we appreciate what we had? Not why didn't we give it all away to other people, right? Like, we have an obligation to give, and we have an obligation to care for those in need. And in the Torah, it talks about tithing, right? 10% of your income. So it's not that the Torah is pretty clear that and our tradition is very clear that we have these responsibilities, but at the same time, it doesn't expect us to all be monks, and we're expected to enjoy things. All right, let's look at another source. So remember I said, tradition changes and responds. So the Shulchan Aruch is a book that's what we would call, what our tradition calls a code. So it begins to really, like the Talmud, which is an ancient book, which is about 1600 years old, doesn't always say, like, we used to be frustrated because we spent a lot of time studying in rabbinical school, and I'd be like, could you just tell me what we're supposed to do? Like, pages and pages of discussion. Some say this and some say that. And I was like, well, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. So at a certain time in Jewish history, about 500-ish years ago, books began to be written about, this is what we're supposed to do. And so remember, I told you, as morality sort of changes or develops, or people poke holes in an issue. And so we all, probably could get behind the idea that we, of course, should support our parents first and our siblings next, and the rest of our family before we present other people in need. But you'll see that this source felt like there's a big hole in the way it was presented. Now, there is something fundamental about the details of the laws above that troubles me deeply. So they're commenting on what we had just read about the hierarchy of your family. For if we explain the text that I have cited according to their simple meaning, that certain groups are prior to others, they imply that one may distribute the entirety of one's tzedakah money to one group within the established hierarchy, and need not give it all to those who fall outside the specific group. In other words, you could decide, so I have $100 to give away and I'm going to give it all to my family. Well, how could that work? How does that work? What about all those other people? How could you possibly say that you could give everything to your family with nothing left over for other people? So this is a real pushback on something that on the earlier source. It is well known that every wealthy person has many more relatives who are poor. And how much more is that true for people whose charity funds are scant? So everybody has family in need. I told you last week, there's a Yiddish curse, and I don't know it in Yiddish, but may you have money and be the only one in your family that does. So everybody has poor relatives. And if you don't have a lot of money, you still have poor relatives. And if this is the case, poor people without wealthy relatives will die of starvation. How is it possible to say this? Therefore, in my humble opinion, the explanation of charity priorities is as follows. Certainly every person, whether of modest or significant means, is obligated to give a portion of their charity to needy people who are not relatives. But to their poor relatives, they should give a greater amount that is given to those who are not related, and so on along the ladder of priorities. Right? So this is how Jewish law develops, right? The person that said you should help your family first had the best of intentions, right? You should help your family first. But then there's a problem, because it could lead people, that need is also endless. And therefore, if you're always struggling to just keep up with your family's needs, what happens to people that don't have wealthy relatives that aren't related to you? They're pretty literal, right? They'll die of starvation. So you have to look at your money and you have to divide it accordingly. You can give a little more to your family, but you must leave something to give to people that are not in your family. Deanna?
So this is something I think I've struggled with, but the 10% tithing, we give significantly more tithing in the form of taxes, which is sort of like an institutionalized form of protecting those who are not in our family, whether it's for fire department or food stamps or whatever it is. What do you think the rabbis then, or the rabbi currently on this Zoom, would have to say about that?
So the Jewish community had its own form of sort of taxation, right? For communal funds. And those I think were considered like within, tzedakah dollars that were given, but it was that the community leaders decided where the money went. Like, did it go for the school? Did it go for, they probably didn't, think about roads and bridges. That wasn't really their responsibility, though we may never get to that either in our government, we'll see. So there was like a communal way of giving that was, and in a way, federation, obviously it's voluntary. Federation would only love to, be able to assess all of us. But in a way, giving to federation really flows out of that long-standing tradition in the Jewish community, because we give our money to federation and then federation decides where it goes. So I'll tell you, it was, Federation, but pre-COVID, every year would do these trips for the rabbis of Chicago. It was really kind of an interesting experience of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox rabbis traveling together, which was unique. A lot of communities could not have pulled that off. And they would take us to some like gut-wrenching place in Eastern Europe, and then they would take us to Israel, and then they would take us to all of these places where Federation was providing social service dollars. And then, of course, they would put us in a room, lock the door, and ask for our pledge. And at that point, once you've been to Vilna and been out to the Ponar forest, where Jews were just gunned down into open pits, then you're like, well, how big of a check am I willing to write? But one of the things that they would tell us, and the trip to Israel was, all of these trips actually was educational in this way, is we would visit all these social service agencies that Federation was helping fund. And everyone kind of made their pitch, right, for why we should support them. And they were all worthy of support. we would have probably given all our money to the very first place that we went because it was so compelling. And then by the 10th place, there'd be no money left, right? And it was this interesting, and they were like, you're not allowed, like the money's come from through Federation, you give the money to Federation. But it was an interesting sort of exercise in understanding why sometimes having an umbrella organization that sees the big picture of need and makes decisions about how to allocate things because is I think more productive than people just their gut reaction in the moment. Because you might decide you want all the money to go to the children. Well, then who gives to like Lieberman? Who gives to the elderly, right? Like, so it was an interesting, like, thing, but that whole system is based on an ongoing system that they had in any place that Jews ever lived. So, I would say that yes, our taxes, a portion of our taxes goes to communal funding that we need to support, but it doesn't erase our obligation to targeted giving above and beyond our taxes. Nancy Schmidt, I see you have your hand up.
I do. Hi. So
Hi.
two quick things. One is, why are children not mentioned in the statement of you take care of your parents first and then your siblings? What happened to the kids?
So that's a fascinating question that I don't actually have an answer to. It could be that the assumption is if you have young children, they're part of your family unit, and of course you're going to take care of them as part of the unit. And it could be that if they're adults, like they're supposed to be taking care of you. But it is interesting to notice in the hierarchy, you would think that something would be said about your obligation to your children, and it doesn't. And you're right, that's a glaring question.
Right, because when I hear that, the first thing that popped into my head was Sophie's Choice, the movie,
Oy.
which of course is horrible, but I'm like, what happened to our children? My other comment is, I find it very insulting to say, what did God do for you?
All right, so I won't use that. I won't use that as a hook then.
Yeah, no, don't use it. But nobody else commented on that in our group. But the funny part is, as a Jew, I never think that's how we're supposed to look at things. I thought you're supposed to look at things as a community and what can you do? And God does, I mean, if we blame God on good or bad things, we might as well just hang up our everything right now. I didn't think Jews believed that kind of theory that, if you're good, God's going to be good to you. And if you're not good or somebody's sick, then you did something wrong. I was just surprised.
So you're absolutely right about that. I think it was a way that the question, and listen, she reported this to me yesterday.
No,
The question is, look, this is let's put it in modern language that I think the young people would use today, which is, what are you going to do with all your privilege? Right? There's a lot of, the whole young people they would use the phrase white privilege, right? I really hate that phrase, frankly, for Jews, but what are you going to do with all of the wonderful things that you are either worked very hard for, or are lucky, or you are in the right place at the right time and you have these things? What is your obligation then to help others?
Right. That's also interesting that you say that teenagers or young people would say white privilege, because all they have to do is look back 1 or 2 generations.
Oh,
and
no. Don't make me tear my hair out.
Okay,
but one of the things, and ask Bret Stephens, we already mentioned Bret Stephens, he actually speaks about this. I think, and this drives me crazy, and this is going to get us far off field, but I have heard young people say, because the example I give in my own family, and every one of us has an example like this. My husband's 16-year-old grandmother, who left Romania with nothing, who traveled here alone, who worked her fingers to the bone to bring her family over.
Yep.
Succeeded. This is what young people on the left would tell you. She had this tremendous advantage because she was white.
Oh. Oh.
Right? And listen, you know, the fact, or everybody's gonna raise their hand, like the fact that nobody considered her white because she was Jewish,
Right.
is, you
gonna
know,
say.
right, right. I
Yeah.
mean, this stuff makes me crazy. It makes me
Right.
crazy. But
they-
that's, but
they
that's
don't-
what young people are saying today. So let's,
They
you
don't
know.
appreciate what it means to be a Jew in the sense of the hatred. And unfortunately, like you said, we can do a class on anti-Semitism, but they're missing that point,
Right.
and that petrifies me.
Right. For those of you that have kids in their 20s, ask them when the census comes and they have to check if they're white. Do they? Let's do a little show of hands. When the census comes and you have to check yourself off as white, do you ever pause for a minute and think about that, or do you ever check other, or do you just check? Yeah, well, of course I'm white. But if you ask our young people, I don't think that they even think about it. They just check it off. Anyways, let's call on other people and let's not talk about we're doing a whole thing on anti-Semitism on the right and the left and why I'm insane about this. Neil Schwartz, welcome. And
Thank you, Rabbi. The Breslows invited me, so we thought we would join. One thing you mentioned about children, and I've always been troubled in in the Torah that we're supposed to honor our father and our mother. But what about the kids? Where do the children fit in terms of the same kind of, should parents honor their children in the sense of who they are, taking care of them? I mean, it's understood that they're being taken care of, but what about a child who is in need? And I think that also reflects in terms of here too, with regards to where are the children when it comes to the food? This is something that's troubled me for years, and I've never come up with really a good answer.
so Judaism sees the obligation of honoring in one way. It's the kid's obligation to honor their parents. What is the parent's obligation to their children? The Talmud actually mentions two things, which is interesting, two interesting things. What are you obligated to do? You are obligated to teach your child a trade, and you're obligated to teach them how to swim. Now, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? So you are obligated to make sure that your children can support themselves, right? By teaching them, making sure that they, you know, now we say, well, then maybe you're obligated to send them to college or to trade school or whatever it is that will enable them to make a living so that they will be independent and they will be able to take care of you if you need to be taken care of. Teaching a child how to swim, right? I would say, I mean, literally they lived along the Kinneret, they lived along the Mediterranean Sea, but I would take it even more to mean you're obligated to teach your children how to keep themselves safe in the world, that they need to have the skills. When the JCC was built in Northbrook many years ago, I wanted them to put that, like a mural of that on the wall, but they declined. I thought that would be a great thing for swim class, to understand that taking your kids to swim class was actually a Jewish obligation on the part of the parents. But you are obligated to keep your children, to teach your children the skills that they will need to keep themselves safe in the world. And you're supposed to teach them Torah, right? You're supposed to teach them Torah. We are told that all over, you know, in the Shema, that we're obligated to teach our children the Jewish tradition. That's it, right? I mean, those are a lot of things, right? I wouldn't say that's it. Those are a lot of things, but that's as far as the obligation goes. Now, the assumption is, of course, if you've got young children and they're living in your home, of course, I would say that you feed them before you feed others. I feel like it seems so obvious that they probably didn't have to say it. But if you did your job well and your obligations as a parent, in theory, you shouldn't have to take care of your children. Now, I don't think there wasn't a lot of recognition or no recognition about special needs and not every child. And our tradition doesn't really address that. You know, our ancient tradition doesn't address that. So there are sort of holes in that when it comes to Jewish law. Rosette?
I don't know when it came into practice, but Friday evenings, we bless our children. And if that doesn't make you aware of the child's place in the family, and this is every week.
But
So,
part of it, like honoring when the tradition asks, like, what does it mean to honor a parent? It means like getting up from your dad's chair or getting up from your chair. Like my kids don't get up from my husband's chair, and it drives him crazy. Like I would have never sat in my dad's chair and not gotten up. I'm like, well, they're a different like casual generation. Like we didn't have that. Like they didn't people just don't do that instinctually. But our tradition is really clear, and it talks about how you care for your elderly parents, even if they're ornery, even if they're difficult, that you have an obligation to take care of your difficult elderly parents, which is, if any of us have been through that, as many human beings have been through this throughout history, it's not always an easy thing to do. And our tradition insists that's what it means. It doesn't say that you have to love them. It doesn't say you have to feel good about it. But this is part of your human obligation to, to care for your parents. Harold.
Last week, when we first started talking about the issue of priorities and giving, you put that issue in the context several times, mentioned the covenant between God and the Jewish people. We haven't mentioned that today. Are we going to learn from the covenant between God and the Jewish people how to better answer those kids when they say, how can you buy a car, or how we do this or how we do that?
So probably not, no. I mean, that's, when we talked about covenantal ethics last week, and we didn't talk about it so much today about the hierarchy between Jews and non-Jews, because we really did cover that last week, is that, Jews in need take priority over non-Jews in need. That's just a given in our tradition, that's considered, our obligation. So today was really more talking about, okay, but how do you determine, is it the people closest to you? Is it the people furthest from you? Remember, we had talked about that Christian giving very often focuses on how you give to the poorest. And so giving, to people in need in Africa would take priority over people that are less in need and closer to home. The sources we looked at today would seem to suggest the exact opposite, right? That you take care of people in need, even their animals, and perhaps even their, even perhaps their laundry, before you would take care of people a little further afield. But I think for me, the most important thing that I feel like I got out of today's sources is this idea that we could look at something and say, that doesn't make sense. Right? That doesn't make sense. Like we need a source that talks about our children because we understand about children's needs in a different way than our ancestors did. Or we need to understand that, whoa, these sources that say we have to take care of our family is a problem for people that don't have wealthy family. We have to develop this. We have to further develop this. We don't have the same kind of needs in the Jewish community, thank God, in the United States, though there are needs in the Jewish community. Like to pretend that nobody in this community has needs is just wrong. So as this is happening, I just want to say that Deanna is chatting me. And I want to say that when we talk about the hierarchy of needs, I'll give you a wonderful example. Deanna's husband, Mark, is a physician, and he has been administering vaccine through his practice. And they had the ability to order pediatric vaccines, and they're offering a vaccine clinic for our children of Am Yisrael this Sunday. She just said CDC has approved it, so hopefully we're moving forward with this. So here's an interesting question.
Wait. It's gone through several layers. Right this minute, they're doing the final hearings.
Okay.
We'll release them. Yeah.
Right. So here's an interesting question. Deanna came to us and said, we have these vaccines. We'd like to offer them to Am Yisrael. This is a perfect example of your townspeople first, right? And we kept it open first for a few days for Am Yisrael. And after all of our parents and grandparents that wanted to get their children and grandchildren signed up, We then offered it to Beth Hillel, right? Our neighboring congregation. And then it was sort of just open to friends and family up. They could have offered it anywhere, right? But the idea of how do you take care of your community first? And so this is just a living example of something that we're like so proud of. And somebody actually, I don't know if I should say this, but another person called and said, could you, if you got more vaccine, could you administer it at our congregation? And it was like, I thought that was a little chutzpahdik. And I'm like, well, if you could get more vaccine, I'd like to offer it again through Am Yisrael. We could invite other people to come, but the idea that we are doing this program through our congregation and offering it to people in need is something that I am super proud that we're doing this. Yeah, somebody actually just chatted me, don't forget the ARC, right? Like, we know that there are needs in our community. We know that there are people that don't have enough food. We know, if any of you have ever delivered food for the ARC on Thanksgiving, you know that there are people that are getting perhaps their only Thanksgiving, sources through the ARC, like, and Maut Chitim and people in need, and there's, and the need to educate our children and the need to take care of our elderly. There are plenty of needs within the Jewish community, and we're obligated to take care of those needs. But we're also, as these sessions have taught us, we are also obligated to think beyond our families, beyond our community. So next week, we're actually talking about environmental ethics. So we're moving away from the idea, the ARC is not under JUF, it's independent. So we're moving into a different topic. There are many, 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 many more sources on this topic that we didn't cover. This was just a taste to sort of get you thinking about how Judaism looks at these things. And I do have all of the sources for this. And I think what I'd like to do, these classes were meant to be in person, and they were meant that every student had their source book in front of them. So I will figure out how to get these sources out to us, but perhaps not like week by week. Perhaps, that's a little complicated given that this is a revolving door of people showing up. So perhaps like when the whole thing is finished, people that want the sources, we can send it, at one time to you. All right, everyone, have a lovely week, and I will see you all hopefully next week.